The contract of incentivizations. So I use the word contract because in any form of business that you might conduct in the world, any technically, even though courts might dispute this at when it's in session, that any form of handwritten document between two individuals that says I hereby sign blah 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 John Doe, that I agree to this. Any form of sort of a written document that's agreed upon between two individuals becomes a form of a contract, or an agreement or shared responsibility, between two individuals. And even though I'm going to preface that this video does not contain any specific ideas to put into practice, it's more symbolic. It sort of is the backbone of me using the other more practical ideas like a whiteboard, or even more so a chores list that you'll print and put on the fridge, to remind the kids of what you expect of them, and sort of what consequences or rewards they can expect from you. So on that sort of narrative, it's sort of this agreement to avoid any form of miscommunication, certainly because consistency and repetition are things that are very important to raising children, or raising future adults. So basically, this goes in the subtle art of incentivizing children in the most efficient forms of administration. I will also discuss my thoughts on distributing privileges, my thoughts on where privileges should be given, and when to take them away. At the center of administering children with their respective repetition and need for it, it is necessary for parents to create these systems, preferably ones that can administer themselves, such as the chores list. While there is no constitution strictly of their parentally guaranteed rights and granted privileges, it is important to make it as concise as possible with any form of a system on what actions the parents will take and what actions one will not take in terms of awards and consequences. And I say this specifically in cases like, just as a big example, like when, avoiding a parent blowing up at a child because they've done this mess like 10 times, and while they might need to be retaught it, for example, such as with the chore, and that would be the better solution than just giving them the soap box, or the guilt foo, for her making the mistake again. I think those sort of things, where the kid just has no idea when a blow up's going to happen, have a negative or adverse effects towards a relationship. Um, so, again, on that note, consistency, knowing when they will receive a consequence, and perhaps avoiding them thinking in their minds that perhaps you do not love them or something like that. So, as I will explain ahead, it is important to distinguish the types of rewards or consequences that will be received for a particular action, such as a behavioral or grade or failure to do chores. It is always necessary to remember that raising a child is vastly different between the relationship between an adult. Just like you wouldn't treat an adult like a child, you wouldn't treat a child like an adult with a fully developed brain. That is, if you intend to foster them well through childhood. But I still like to get as close as possible and maintaining this mindset of making future adults. And that is where I try to incorporate democratic elements into parenting. Because while the parents are still governmentally a monarchy consisting of a king and queen, father, mother, elements of consistency can be reinforced through this Magna Carta of sorts, or something like, a constitution. So, again, do not. I mean, even though you're raising future adults and not trying to raise, someone to be a good kid, you certainly wouldn't treat them the same way as you would, a neighbor. I think those sort of things can fall on more of the permissive scale of parenting. So, I've read 3 generalized parenting types on a, again, authoritarian parenting would be more like treating them like a peasant or a serf, someone that's never going to get their rights, never going to be an adult. just for so you can see the scale of problems that can be created. I've read 3 generalized parenting types on a spectrum, though, between permissive, authoritative, and authoritarian. I've mentioned these in the other video, but just so you know, authoritative is between permissive and authoritarian. It is best, though, to inhabit this middle ground of being authoritative. Authoritative suggests, or it emphasizes, sensitivity, reasoning, setting limits, and being emotionally responsive. Whereas in society, an adult has the brain capacity to intuit consequences of their actions and will receive social, economic, and criminal consequences potentially for bad actions. In a kid's world, those brain facilities are not yet or are often undeveloped. They must learn through experience, and this is critical while they are a child, or else, they may suffer a huge learning curve as an adult. Remember in cartoons, though, when a child would step on like a loose floorboard and it would come back up and slam them in the face? Symbolically, that's what the teaching children through experience can feel like. It's frustrating and sometimes difficult to remind yourself that these are the same issues that you suffered through decades ago when your brain was also still in development. There's also a part inside of every parent, I would imagine, that they want to prevent those experiences from happening again in their child, yet no amount of communication can prevent them. It seems like that dilemma again, symbolically, I'll mention, sometimes you have to be that floorboard, in terms of giving a consequence for, a negative action. And socially, many parents want to be friends with their kids more than a parent to their kids. There's a statement I've heard before that a parent cannot be friends with their children while they're children. And it can result in a confusing tribal structure where the parent just wants the kid to acknowledge that the parent is the head figure, but not administer consequences to them, or simply treat the child as an equal and speak to them like an adult. However, I think this has an adverse effect in leading the child to challenging the parent's authority, since there's no form of, regularity, consistency, what responsibility they have. The child does not know the limitations, rules, etc., and this must be reminded, reinforced, and written for the child to remind themselves, as I mentioned in creating like a chores list or, using a whiteboard. And the stress that this lack of remembering the consistent rules can cause many lead to sort of bipolar parenting, only using the 2 extreme shades of permissive and authoritarian. For example, the parent being extremely permissive with rules and boundaries and chores until the point of blowing up because the child has pushed too many buttons in the parent. As a result, the subsequent blow up and possibility of withdrawing affection as a consequence is stressful for all parties involved. And it just creates something that's very inconsistent for the child. They don't know when, the parent is going to blow up, for example. So again, history does repeat itself, and for many lessons, if a parent does not administer lessons when they are a child, the child may be doomed to repeat them again as an adult. They will not understand while the world frowned upon them when they are unable to show manners at the appropriate times, listen at the appropriate times, hold back foul language at the appropriate times. So set up a schedule and also maintaining a routine for themselves. Showing up to work on time, using money effectively, maintaining eye contact, and the list goes on, ad nauseum. Types of consequences. So the mindset to giving consequences is first and foremost how I can teach my child to prevent this same course of action from happening again. In my other video, I mentioned that, certainly another incentivization is using money, and I think it certainly can help in teaching someone how to do a job very well. I think this is also, though, depending on whether a parent can afford to give out an allowance to the children. So, in this main thing, in this other thing though, there's a, another fine line you have to establish in what sort of permissions you're going to grant. I think something like if you look at driving a vehicle, a driving test will tell you that, well, driving is not a right, it is a permission. So certainly I'll use that in the same thing of saying something like, well, electronics, of which the parent is paying for, the price of using electricity, that is it is a permission, it is not a right. So, again, I'll use something like that as a form of, a consequence or something that has to be earned. In other words, if you want to look at it in the more positive light, just say, well, it needs to, you need to do, your chores before you earn the privilege of using electronics. So the mindset to giving consequences, as I said, is first and foremost, how can I teach my child to prevent this same course of action from happening again? So, and that's why I think it really here, it needs to be sort of distributed, it needs to be logical, and it needs to be sort of in each of its own categories. So the first one I'm going to use is poor grades. Some may argue this, but I think grades are the most important. Yes, charisma and diligence will get you farther in life than intellect will usually. However, there is only one time and period of life where school is free. So good grades can lead to the negation of how authoritarian the parent will be or not, types of consequences for rule breaking. So, despite claims that, for example, my school sucks, I think that more often than not, if you try your hardest or even hard at school, then teachers are more than willing to give you as many opportunities for a good grade as possible. In these cases of failure to get good grades overall, and there are exceptions, but I usually see this as the child needing more attention and not less. So if you look at the scale of permissive to authoritarian, they definitely need more sort of intervention. But again, like I mentioned in my other videos, it's how you do it, not whether you do it. This also means that they may need to use their life to be more consistent through scheduling. So that would be more of how you do it, is how can I schedule my kids' time, perhaps, or, that would be the positive way of looking at it. The negative way would be how can I, perhaps take some things away like their phone so that they can spend more time on doing their homework without being distracted. That sort of attention is what needs to be implemented. However, this also includes the elimination of distractions when necessary. To me, that scheduling results in a stricter time for homework, increase to, a sort of no electronics time, etc. And what I mean by an increase is, like, let's say they go to bed at 9 p.m., but you'll say, oh, well, your no electronics time starts at 8, and that would be the time that they have to either read or do homework or chores. These constraints, though, add limitations on the contract of electronics. While one might allow a phone and therefore use music for cleaning, that may also be taken away. For example, so let's say if during their no electronics time, they would like to use music, like I said, that's something that privilege can be taken away. Same goes, though, for using their phone during, a scheduled homework period, or being able to use any other electronic device during these purposes. And as always, this means being encouraged that the child asks for help when they need it. So this is especially important for homework. If the kid does get behind with homework, something especially like math, it's always, a foundation to learning the next thing. You need to learn addition to learn multiplication. You need to learn multiplication to do the next one, to the power of, I can't remember the official name of it. So, certainly if they've not learned these, learning blocks, or if they need, help with reading, these things, this is where the parent has to give active time to the kid as opposed to just rescheduling something here or there. So certainly, like that quote, if you need help at Hogwarts, help will always be there for those that ask. So, But the intention behind this is not only to decrease objects that would take an individual needing to accomplish something's focus away, but it is also intended to create value in a privilege that can be lost. So, something, obviously if you don't want to lose your electronics or your privileges, or the things that you enjoy as a kid, you have to, it's also creating, well, that's really important to me. I definitely don't want to lose that. So, that's what something like taking it away would also create is value. Overall, it's necessary to create these rules of cause and effect so the child thinks that this is the reason behind my actions, instead of something like mom and dad are doing this because he or she hates me. For example, there's no explanation given to the kid and or no consistency to make, why the consequence exists clear. So again, that is especially true if the parent is going to blow up. As a parent, these become tough times because there can often be a nugget to finding why they are having school difficulties, and perhaps, even more so why they're so behind. You have to take the microscope here and know that each day may be a battle at accomplishing the task of homework. Spending an hour a day with that kid so that they can get through their homework. Might involve reteaching a school lesson, spending an hour with them on homework, as I said, etc. I think it's also worth perhaps contacting the teacher or pushing the kid to talk to the teacher, and stuff that they can make up with, or, why the kid is so behind. And perhaps then more information will be revealed, like, oh, well, the kid was spending, their entire class on their phone, or they were sitting in the back of the class sleeping, or perhaps they can't see the board. Fortunately, I've noticed during teenage years, there's often a point where a kid does not want to waste their time on the inefficient rediscovering of age-old topics by their parents that it can often take an hour for them to re-explain. At this point, the Neanderthal parent is often deemed unnecessary and they can figure it out on their own. Thank you, Internet. And what I mean there is, even though in my other videos I'll mention there's a difference between, there's two types of lecturing. There's the sort of soap op, blow up, form of sermon parenting, or lecturing, excuse me. But there's also the one where perhaps they need to be retaught, their chore, or, it just needs to be shown physically with as few words as possible. I often find that when there is a conflict, it is best to discuss it at peace and not in war. Usually war is not the solution to peace, or it does not lead to the solution of peace. So, especially as kids get older, more consciousness is there. They know when there's something wrong. They don't need to be reminded on it 10,000 times. It often just leads to more resentment. And that's why creating sort of a contract of incentives, knowing what their responsibilities are and just flat out giving the consequence when it doesn't happen. I think it's always worth it to give them, say, well, if you don't agree with it, you can give me 30 seconds worth of lip, hopefully it doesn't use cuss words or anything else, but, beyond that discussion, especially during peace, I'll always discuss those things during peace. During war, that's not a solution, whether the child is deciding to raise hell or if it's the parent that's deciding to raise hell. So, on that note, the older the kid gets, the more difficult it is to start these forms of, repetition, chores, etc., responsibilities, grades. The next one of, sort of where I'll push consequences, privileges, or allowances, perhaps, is failure to accomplish chores. So I have another video about creating a chores list, and I think it makes that form very consistent in terms of what's expected. But before its existence, it seemed like a daily devotion to remind them to clean their room, and it took about 20 times is what it felt like before it would be finished. Since that they would get distracted, they didn't think it was that important or what have you. Of course, cleaning your own room isn't as important, but to a kid, but I mean, obviously they're not seeing yet that something like organization and cleaning your room might lead to organized thoughts, for example. So, regardless, it led to lectures, which they didn't want to hear, and me stressing over the clock and them getting stressed out about doing it at the last minute, 5 minutes before bedtime, which I didn't really want to think about. And at that point, they were usually too tired to want to think about. This is where I created a weekly chores chart, as I have in my Parenting 1 video, and told them that past the sort of age of 10, I said no more lectures, and especially if you want, no more reminders, since they didn't want to hear it as I didn't want to say it. Again, the list was posted on the fridge, and they knew every one of their requirements. Again, just because there were no more reminders didn't mean that they didn't need to be retaught. No one likes being reminded what they need to do, and so the rules are simple. They have a contract of electronics, phone, television, computer, video games. If they fail to accomplish their chores, they lose that contractual privilege of electronics the next day. So I think it's fairly cut in stone that way. They know what they have, they know what they can lose, and they have to essentially again, there's a negative way of saying it, and I use that in this video from parent to parent, but I think more the positive way to say it to a kid is you would need to earn the privilege to use these things. Even if they don't want to hear the fact that you're paying electricity or something like that. And note that even as an exception, I tell them if it is 1 second before bedtime, as long as you tell me you forgot to do your chores and that you will renegotiate with me and are willing to behaviorally, that you will and how you will do them in the near future. As in, I will clean my room tomorrow, or I have a party tomorrow, I'll clean it in 2 days. I will not, in those cases, I will not give them that consequence. So again, as long as they're willing to communicate with me, I'm willing to, be compromising with them. That is too, though, if it is followed through. If it gets failed to, and especially if it's like, I think I mentioned this in my other video, if it's been like 2 weeks and they haven't cleaned the room and they've renegotiated with me every day, at some point I'm going to have to cut the line. Even in this situation, though, I am more loose on this consequences if their grades are good. In that case, it becomes more important. The grades are more important, and how, really it comes down to also how frequent is the mistakes being made. So, again, on the authoritarian permissive scale, if their grades are good, I'll be more permissive. If their grades are bad, I'll tend to put more. I'll use that part of authoritarian that means more paying attention, more time, And by all means, even though kids might think that we want to ruin their lives, I think ultimately most parents want to be as permissive as possible. Up to the point of teaching them to be good adults. And that's why if these systems work well, then you can afford to be more permissive. So, again, if their grades are good, I'm more willing to accept these, let go of these other things, which, the chores, and then what's going to be the third form of incentives, consequences, punishments, however you want to put it, is the third one I would say is behavioral. I usually give the benefit of the doubt for these and presume that the root of being unreasonable is physiological, like illness, sleep deprivation, sugar high, etc. It is very difficult to work together, kind of as I said with my, you can't make peace with war, and find a solution, though, when a child becomes frenzied. And on that note, I think it's worth noting that, even if the kid has a blow up and goes to their room, I find it more effective to talk with them when they've calmed down than it is when they're amped up. Same thing goes both ways. An amped up parent, ready to do battle is not likely to lead to a positive solution. It honestly depends on what emotion is being expressed and the necessary response. Anger and tears do not necessarily require the same response, for example. Usually, I think it is best to find a place for the individual to vent, whether it is to the parent or it needs to be expressed in a separate space, like I used in the if the kid has to settle down for 10 minutes. So whether that's in bed or perhaps outside, like something like a timeout. The best time I find to speak, teach, and learn is usually after the wave of emotions. In the case of tears, nurturing usually comes from the lesson afterwards. When overwhelmed with emotion, though, even as an adult, it is not easy to listen and learn. The energy drowns out the reason, and as such, I usually find it better to wait till the torrent is over before discussing. In general, with expressing opinions, especially before it becomes volatile, I find it best to let the person air out their opinion, sometimes for a set time limit. Like I said earlier, if you say, I know you don't want to do this and you think that perhaps your sister should take out the trash, and if you if something that perhaps in the big picture is petty to you, I'll give you 30 seconds to a minute to express your opinion, as long as it's not destructive or something like I hate my sister, or they're dropping curse words. If they're just expressing why they don't agree with it and they think it's unfair, that's when I'll let the emotions slide, because obviously sometimes people just need to vent. There's definitely a productive and a reductive negative way to express opinions on both sides of the fence, as a parent or a kid, as long as they know that they may or may not get their way. So again, if they express their opinions, they might not get what they want. Getting the first step of expressing the opinions out goes a long way for the individual feeling that their voice has been heard, though, and I think that's really imperative. A difference between authoritative parenting and authoritarian parenting is that they still need to be listened to. Certainly, even if you create something set in stone and consistent, like a chores list, if their history teacher gives them a boatload of homework every Monday night, perhaps the cleaning of the room might need to be rescheduled, or if they spend 2 hours on math, you need to talk to the math teacher and figure out what they're not learned. What's the problem? Can they not see the board? Are they just sitting in the back of class, staring at their phone? That's where these things need to be discussed. And if the kid resents you, doesn't trust you, they're not going to share these things, then there's going to be a break, and you're just going to be frustrated on not having a solution. So behavioral is definitely the one that's the one that's most like swimming out at sea when there's high tides and low tides, and there's definitely, it just has to be dealt with for the appropriate emotions. But when they get nasty, whether it's you or the kid, it's best to stop it, separate it, discuss it later when things have calmed down at peace and people have been able to reflect. And certainly when the kid gets nasty, I think that's when that break of using going and spending time in the room by themselves or spending the time outside are probably best, essentially like when people say take a walk to an adult. So others, besides chores, behaviors, and grades, these are more in the minority, I would say, but physical violence from a kid, consistency of like a foul mouth with warnings, rude, combative, disrespectful, etc. I mean, these definitely go in behavioral problems, when they get really ugly, especially between siblings. I think, even if it's a young kid and they might not have the same morality system as an adult, where they know that, oh, I just punched Jimmy, that's wrong. I think usually even like cases of physical violence, though, I think the kid does know that they're in the wrong and they're being abusive, so what was I going to say? So these are pretty much the only instances that I'll give a full out grounding for. I really don't like taking this action because usually the response in my experience is that mom and dad hate me. But sometimes it has been necessary as a reminder that there are consequences for blatant rule breaking. Basically, it's the same thing in the real world. You can't go out and punch someone, or you can't threaten someone, Those are the few, you know, the few limitations to freedom of speech is, you can't threaten someone's life, and you can't, speak things that are not true about them either, so certainly saying, trying to keep this PG, but saying somebody is, gosh, I don't even know, uh, you know, is a, a really bad person, you know, uh, you know, something that might not be true, or, yeah, anyways, I really can't, I'm going to use like something like the W word, or, you know, or an S word or something. Those to me would be more slander. And again, if it's consistent, I'd be more likely to give out a grounding in those cases as a very real consequence to something that could happen in the real world and have a very real consequence for. I think that definitely sort of aligns with the democratic approach. So, but outside of that, and usually conflicts between two siblings, I usually try and find a creative solution. This is in the case of one stealing another's items, abusing a toy, losing a toy, an argument turned sour, etc. Usually, I find it preferable that they initially try and deal with it between one another. If that fails, then usually both parties are inevitably responsible. And that's the truth. I mean, in most of these cases, both the kids are responsible. When both of them were provoking each other, both of them were fighting each other. It doesn't matter who threw the first punch. In this case, I will either let them choose whether they want to share the same pitfall or consequence and ask whether it was worth it, or get creative, like I said. For example, if one abuses another's room or item or steals something, I may have them trade the item or rooms for that day. So I'll say, like, if someone hasn't cleaned their room, and no matter how much pleading or begging or reminding, and the fact that the chores there, I hate to get to that term where I have to remind them 1,000 times, and and then both parties just seem, flogged in a sense. That basically, saying, well, if you're not going to take the responsibility for your room, I'm just going to let your sister have it for the day, something like that. And let them sleep in the bed for that night. Yeah. So, something creative that I guess gives them a different, perhaps, perspective or mindset. I wouldn't do something like that too consistently, because the last thing I want as a parent is creating sibling resentment too. But, again, most of those situations, they're pretty rare anyways, because most of the situations where, it's between two siblings, both are responsible regardless. But that was just an example. Just see what works and perhaps what doesn't. Privileges and where they earn and lose them. I have told my children time and time again that education, personal responsibility, and behavior are the three themes of success. In translation to their interest, if they can demonstrate good grades, which are A's and B's for me, accomplishing their own chores, and keep their behavior in check, that I am more than willing to loosen rules such as no electronics periods, bedtimes, etc. In the parenting scale of permissive, authoritative, and authoritarian, I will become more permissive as a parent the better they do with these three themes. They will receive these extra privileges. And again, even though I might translate these into more of like a Skinner's box or something that seems very methodical and cold, I think it's better to present them in that positive manner of earning privileges. Something like, your bedtime might go from 9 to 10, or something like, well, I just, if your grades are that good and you're a great reader in class, well, then maybe I won't have a mandatory reading period before bed. So naturally, this lends itself well as they transition into adulthood, when a parent is no longer there to encourage them and teach them through mistakes. On a final note, it is about incentivization. One of the worst things to a child's ear is threatening the nap or a timeout. The threat itself, in my experience, does not work. while the actual action of a nap may give them the rest that they truly need, as I mentioned, the behavioral and physiological needs, like they stayed up too late, and they need sleep, or they have, a sugar high, or they've just been eating really crappy food or something. So a nap might give them the help, the rest that they truly need, or the time out to let emotions flow with the wind and come back ready to reason, or something like that. So I look at the incentivization in doctor terms. There are two generalized ways to treat an illness: proactive and reactive. In other words, before you have sickness and once you have achieved it. So how are you going to conquer these things? Certainly, even though you go to a doctor because you're already sick or something has already happened, the proactive approach is much, much easier. And that's why all these forms of parenting tools I would consider more proactive approaches, because I don't think people want the reactive approach where somebody blows up, someone doesn't know what the heck's going on, why they're getting a consequence or something along those lines. I can't imagine a case where people wouldn't want the former of a proactive approach when at all possible. Avoid the illness and take healthy precautions. For example, if a kid is not sleeping well, you can wait, or excuse me, let's say the kid's just tired. So, the reactive approach would say, well, I'm sick of this attitude. It's nap time. The proactive approach would be, well, maybe for an 8-year-old, an 8-9 p.m. bedtime is too much. Maybe they should go to bed at 7 p.m. Perhaps. That would be more of the proactive approach, is that, there needs to be an adjustment here to prevent this problem from consistently happening again and again. I think it's important to teach these kids things too, because perhaps one day they'll be raising kids, but certainly they'll need to know that, oh, well, I can't stay up till 2 a.m. in college. My test scores are just floppy because, I've stayed up too late. However, it is the necessary evil when the reign of terror starts to emerge from the child and the reactive approach is required. And just preparing the best reactive doctoring that you can surmount without joining them in anger. How you work through children in regards to this will either assist or hold them back towards coping as they grow up. Again, if you're going to do as much as you can to help the child, which I assume most parents are, it's how you do it in those situations. Again, why I recommend the proactive approach. Clear guidelines, consistency. They know what's right and what's wrong, what works and what doesn't work. Regardless, and I know I hear this response a lot too, but even if the kid's trying to be creative, one of the best things a creative kid can do is to be organized, because certainly all of those creative thoughts are going to be completely jumbled up, like the room that they're in, if it's not clean, and certainly, even if you look at the best artists, I'm sure I'll have a video at this at some point, but even some of the most well-known artists, are essentially, they work a lot, because, it's certainly, creativity is something like, an extremely competitive deal. And that's life in many cases, so certainly, the Stephen Kings out there, who I've read in the past works, every day but his birthday, Thanksgiving, Christmas, and New Year's. If you're going to try and be the best at some sort of really creative, entrepreneurial, innovative deal, you definitely need that form of regimen to take care of your own problems with as little backup or bullshit as possible. I guess I just broke the PG rating. As little as that as possible, so that they can focus on what's really the most important. So, definitely, this is the foundation, even though you might want your kid to be, creative or what have you. Again, it's so fundamental to knowing what battles are worth fighting and what battles are not worth fighting. Procrastinating about doing something as simple as cleaning the room, and something that might take 10 minutes taking 30 minutes. So regardless, back on the prairie of peace with kids, it is important that children know what is tolerated and what is not tolerated. And again, that just goes with what I just said with consistency. Also note that I use the word child, but I usually mean before pre-adult in general. Some of these lessons apply specifically to an age group, usually grade school and above. Certainly it's going to be harder to express these things to a younger kid, you know. So, however, while some of these lessons may seem silly to a teenager, it is on how much easier it is to introduce systems, teach, and incentivize children when they are younger rather than older. Point being, if you can do it when they're younger, please do it. Again, with the chores list, I even had kids wondering why they weren't part of the chores list when they were, younger too, like younger than grade school perhaps. But, even having them do something like, clean up their dirty clothes instead of just throwing them on the floor gave them a sense of accomplishment as well. And certainly on that list of some topics of this contract, I guess symbolically would be, very existential and something a kid might not understand, when they're 8 or 5. The older you wait to teach them these things as an adult or like a young adult, especially high school, they're just going to sit there and think you're bullshitting them because, there's been so much of a period of chaos and disorganization perhaps that they're just going to think that this is some weird midlife crisis that you're having, or you're just trying to, rattle their feathers or something like that. So certainly, there's a peak. It's it's good to teach them these things when they're younger, than when they're older. And there's definitely a time period to teach them every step of what they need to do, and that's why you have to be receptive, incredibly receptive. So, anyways, I think that's about all. Hopefully that helped someone out there. And cheers. Thank you. I think that was a final thought before before I exit this. Is teaching kids lessons without just being the floorboard. This is really about being receptive. Is that it's like going up to the front door to an, if it, it's like, really it's like creativity itself. You can't just, go up to if you're trying to sell a vacuum to someone, like you can't just go up to the door and knock on it and say, hey, you want a vacuum? There's got to be like creative ways to teaching these lessons, and that definitely requires being receptive. So without sounding like some sort of, cryptic messenger, I think, teaching these lessons to kids, without having them go out in the real world and wonder why nobody's willing to hire them, or while they, they're only spending, 5 minutes a day clean, doing something productive at home, like, writing if they wanted to be a writer. I think you definitely have to take some, not only consistent but very receptive approaches to teaching these lessons to them, even if it means you have to wait till they go through the lesson, wait till the calm period, and then have a rational discussion with them. So, I think it's sort of like, how can I, if you're like back in a mouse trap or something, how do I get through, into a house without going through the front door? You have to get creative. Like if you were Santa and you had to, climb down someone's chimney or something, obviously, all of this symbolically, but that's the sort of approach you have to take. And it definitely, if you're like at a card game, you have to be that person, that's taking in all the data of the facial expressions people are giving you and being able to transmit that into something. But certainly you couldn't just, it would be much different than playing cards, blinds and just drinking, as if you were drunk and just throwing them out there. I think in that situation, you'd be the loser. Hopefully that makes sense. Just, creative, innovative, getting around the door, thinking outside the box type methods that definitely require lots of listening, which can definitely be different at the end of the day. Cheers. Thank you.